Hello Year 9. Today is your first lesson on your next topic in history. Your next topic is the Holocaust. This is one of the most difficult and upsetting topics that we teach at Round A. And therefore normally it would be really important that we were together, that we were able to discuss things and that we were able to support each other as you listen to some stories which are heart-wrenching. Obviously we can't be together, which is a shame. And so it's really important to remember that if you feel upset by any of the topics that you look at, that you tell an adult at home, or if you feel like you can't do that, that you get in touch with your teacher. We know this is a difficult topic. It's particularly difficult if you are Jewish or if you have family members who are Jewish, or if you are someone who has experienced persecution in your life, then that makes this topic even harder. So please be kind to yourselves. Remember that if you're struggling with something, you should pause the video and go away from the lesson for a minute, and that you should talk to someone, okay? Because if this is a topic that really you're finding difficult, it's important to let someone know and to talk about that, because things always feel better when you've spoken about them. That being said, it's such an important topic, and we wouldn't be asking you to do this at home if we didn't really believe that it was important that you knew about this topic. So let's get started. You need either your history book or some paper or a Word document that you're working on open, and you need to write your title. Your title is Who Were the Jews of Europe Before World War II? And today's lesson, as you go through, you're just going to listen to me explain some of the information about Jewish life in Europe before World War II, and occasionally I'm going to ask you to answer questions. When you're answering those questions, it's important that you do your best, that you include lots of detail, and that you write in full sentences. Just a few things to be aware of as well. If you are writing about Jewish people or Jews or Judaism, you need to have a capital J. And just as we go through, just make sure you're being careful about spellings that you're not used to, so that your work's really good quality and it can all get stuck into your book when you're back at school. So before we get started, I just wanted us to think for a minute about what the Holocaust actually is. You might have looked at this in some other lessons in school. I know that you look at the boy in the striped pyjamas in English, and you also might have looked at the Holocaust in primary school as well, so you probably have some ideas already. But I wanted to give you an idea of what the Holocaust is, and because there is a really important specific description that we need to understand about the Holocaust. So the Nazis came to power in 1933 in Germany. Between 1933 and 1939, Jewish people faced terrible discrimination, and some were killed. However, the Holocaust didn't start until the Second World War in 1939. Now, the Second World War saw the mass killings of approximately 6 million Jewish people across Europe. Now, that is what we see as the Holocaust, because this was a genocide. It was an attempt by the Nazis to destroy Jewish life in Europe and to destroy the Jewish population. A genocide was specifically designed and had a clear purpose, which was to kill as many Jewish people as possible. And so it's during the Second World War when the Holocaust occurs. The Holocaust ended with the defeat of Nazi Germany, and you can see what devastating impact it had been able to have on the Jewish population. 90% of Jewish children were killed during the Holocaust. Now, at the same time, there were other persecutions going on. So the Nazis persecuted Roma and Sinti people, who were sometimes called gypsies, and they were also victims of their own genocide. We see that as separate to the Holocaust because they were separate groups and they were persecuted for different reasons. However, for both groups, the Nazis attempted to remove them from Germany, from Europe. So they were victims of genocide. There were other groups who were persecuted by the Nazis who weren't victims of a genocide. So this included disabled people, gay men, political opponents to the Nazis, and also Polish people and people in the Soviet Union. Now, those people were persecuted and killed in huge numbers, but we don't see them as being part of a genocide because it wasn't an attempt by the Nazis to completely remove those people from Europe. There was no attempt to kill all of those people. Okay, so just to recap then, the definition of the Holocaust is the attempt to totally destroy Jewish life and Jewish people in Europe that occurred between 1939 and 1945. It's really important that we don't just see Jewish people as victims. They became victims during the Holocaust, but they were people with ordinary lives, people who had families, people who had careers, people who had hobbies, people who fell in love, who had close friendships. And we need to understand that the people who were killed during the Holocaust were individuals. And so this lesson, what I'm hoping is that you'll get a bit of a sense of what it was like to be Jewish in Europe. And we're going to focus on the 1920s because it was in that decade that the Nazis were not yet a political force anywhere in Europe. So we're going to think about what life was like for Jewish people in 1920s Europe. Okay, so what was life like for people in Europe in the 1920s? In some places, life was changing quite quickly, and in others, life continued to be relatively traditional. You can see on your map here that the countries in Europe looked a little bit different to how they do now. You can see that there is, towards the right of the map, there's a huge green area. That was, at the time, the Soviet Union, and that was a collection of different communist countries, all governed by the Communist Party in Russia. And in these countries, people lived a very hard life. Peasants worked on collective farms in the countryside, using very traditional farming techniques and being treated very badly by the Soviet government. And workers worked incredibly long hours in factories, similar to the factories like you've seen in the Industrial Revolution in Britain that you were looked at in Year 8. So life was very hard for the people that lived in the large green area of the Soviet Union. Life was also hard for people living in Eastern Europe. So you can see Eastern European countries here, like Poland, for example. Hungary was another example as well. The majority of people in those countries lived in rural areas and were farmers. And you can see the type of farming that occurred in the 1920s in Eastern Europe in this picture just here. This picture here shows what farming was like in 1920s Europe. You can see that they're using very traditional tools and that this would have been very hard physical labour. However, life for people in Western Europe was changing quite quickly, particularly life for women. You can see I've just put a green spot here. That shows that women were more likely to go to work in the 1920s. She's also wearing a looser fitting dress. It's more relaxed than would have been seen before the 1920s. She's got short cut hair. That shows that fashions were changing and women were more able to express themselves in the 20s. In Britain, the first ever Labour government, which I've just shown you here, the first ever Labour government was elected in 1924, which shows that politics was starting to change as well. It was becoming more open. Women had just gained the vote. Working class men had the vote and were able to elect people to represent them in Parliament. So in Western Europe, life was becoming more modern quite quickly. Most people lived in cities. Social ideas about who could be in power and who could work were changing. Jewish people are people who believe in Judaism. Judaism is a religion that's very similar in some ways to Christianity and Islam. Just like Christianity and Islam, Jewish people believe that there is one God, that God is all loving and all powerful. The Jewish holy book is the Torah, which you can see in the bottom left of your screen. This is very similar to the Christian Old Testament. It includes stories like that of Moses. And the story of Moses is very important because this is in some ways the foundation story for Jewish people, because Moses led Jewish people away from slavery in Egypt across the desert to their homeland in what is now Israel. If you look on the map on your screen, you can see that Israel is just here. It's a tiny section of land just there in the peninsula which connects Africa to Asia. At the time, that land was called Judea. So Israel is an incredibly important place for Jewish people now, because many see Israel as their homeland. So Jewish people believe that the Jews are God's chosen people, and that they have a responsibility to live life in a way that sets an example for the rest of the world's population. So they keep really high standards of community. They help their community. They keep high standards of cleanliness. And follow other rules that mean that they try to live a good life. Jewish people lived in lots of different parts of Europe. They lived in England, they lived in France, they lived in Russia, they lived in Eastern European countries, and their life in those different countries varied. The same goes for Jewish people that lived in one country. So a Jewish person could be a wealthy Jewish person living in Leeds, and compared to a poorer Jewish person living in London, their lives would be very different. They would have different interests, different family life. So we have to bear in mind that for Jewish people, really the main similarity is just the religion. There's not really anything else that unites Jewish people across Europe. So we need to have a look at what life was like for different Jewish people in different parts of Europe. To begin with, we're going to look at Eastern Europe. So this includes countries like Poland and like Hungary, places that were part of the Soviet Union. So what I'm going to ask you to do in a second is to pause the video, read the information, and have a go at using less than 50 words to describe Jewish life in Eastern Europe. What you can see here is about the equivalent of about 150 words, maybe 200 words. So you need to basically read the information and summarise it. It's important to bear in mind that for people living in Eastern Europe, if they lived in a rural place like a shtetl, which was a small town in a rural area where most people would have been working in agriculture, their life would have been very different from a Jewish family living in a city. So at the bottom you can see two pictures. In one picture you can see a wooden hut in a shtetl, and some children and an older man as well, and the children are holding a goat. So that probably gives a little bit of a view of what life was like for Jewish people in a shtetl. But in comparison, you also had Jewish people living in cities. So to the right, you can see a picture of a very smartly dressed Jewish family walking down a street in Warsaw in Poland. So try and describe life in Eastern Europe, but bear in mind that there were slight differences, or significant differences really, between those Jewish people living in rural areas and those living in urban areas. So if you pause your video now and have a go at that task. So life for Jewish people living in Western Europe was quite different, mostly because Jewish people were more likely to live in cities. You can see here that there's a family from a city in Denmark who are relaxing on a beach. They've obviously gone on holiday. And there's also a testimony from a Jewish person living in France, Claudette Kennedy, and she lived in Paris. So it was much more normal in Western Europe for Jewish people to live in cities. And they were much more, in some ways, more assimilated with the rest of the population because they lived in cities. So assimilated just means that there were more similarities between them. So have a read through that information and do the same thing again. So what was life like for Jewish people in Western Europe? Again, see if you can use less than 50 words. So pause your video now. Germany is a country in Central Europe. It has some similarities with Eastern European countries, but in the 1920s it was probably more similar to Western European countries like Britain and France. Germany was a very big country with many cities, and Jewish people were most likely to live in those cities, although there were some Jewish people who lived in rural areas. I want you to do the same thing again. So less than 50 words describe what life was like for Jewish people in Germany using the information. If you pause your video and have a go at that task now. Although it's possible to make some generalizations about Jewish people living in different parts of Europe, it's important that we don't just see Jewish people as part of generalizations. So we're going to be introduced now to three different Jewish families: the Greenmans, the Pittles, and the Kleinmans. I'm going to tell you a bit about each of these families now, and when you get to the end of the descriptions of each of these three families, these are the tasks that I'm going to ask you to do. So bear that in mind while you're listening. So you're going to have to identify some similarities between the different families. You're also going to have to identify some differences, and you're going to have to think about which of the families had the most difficult life and to explain your answer. So while you're listening, bear in mind that you're going to have to do those things at the end. So the first family that I'm going to introduce you to are the Kleinmans. You can see a picture of the Kleinmans here. On the far left is Herta. Then there is the dad, Gustav. Sitting on his lap is Kurt. Then standing, the boy is Fritz. The mum is Teeny. She's sitting in the chair. And then finally is Edith, standing on the right. She was the eldest child. The Kleinmans were from Vienna in Austria. They were a relatively poor family. Sometimes they did well, but sometimes they really struggled to survive. Gustav was a skilled worker. He was an upholsterer, which meant he made furniture that involved cloth. So things like chairs that were covered in cloth, like armchairs. He made mattresses. The two boys, Fritz and Kurt, enjoyed taking mattresses out of Gustav's workshop and setting up mini circuses in the street to entertain the local children. So they had a real sense of fun, and they had a very happy childhood, even though sometimes the family didn't have enough food to eat. They were very loving, and they were really devoted to each other. Now, not many people in Austria were Jewish. The population of Austria that was Jewish was relatively small, but most of the Jewish people lived in Vienna. So they would have known lots of other Jewish people. About 10% of the population of Vienna was Jewish. They also had lots of non-Jewish friends, and they had a close relationship with those people. Austrians spoke German, so many people in Austria believed that Austria should join Germany. And what we'll see in a few lessons' time is that did eventually happen. And that's when things started to get more difficult for the Kleinmans. So the next family that we're going to look at was an extended family. There are 27 members of this family that you can see in the picture here. They include 2 grandparents, 2 parents, 10 children, and then those children's husbands, wives, and their children as well. So clearly the Pittel family were very close to each other, not just as a nuclear family, but as an extended family. And they obviously had a happy family life, because here they wanted to get together to remember an important event. Now, that important event was that one of the children, Joseph, who I've just labelled here, Joseph was about to move to Israel. So I mentioned before that Israel was incredibly important for Jewish people. Clearly, Joseph was very religious, and that's probably what inspired his move to Israel. There were other places closer by that could offer him just as good job opportunities, but Joseph obviously wanted to go to Israel, which suggests that the family were very religious. The family were very poor. They would have often struggled to get enough money together to help them to eat. And we know that because they lived in a shtetl called Parcha, that was in Poland, and this shtetl was mostly agricultural village. Although the family didn't do agricultural work, most of the men were shoemakers. But the reason why we know that the family were probably quite poor is that the women also went to work. And that implies, at a time when family was incredibly important, and when women, if they could afford to, normally stayed at home to look after the children, at this time, the fact that the women in the Pittel family were going to work shows that they were very poor. In contrast, the Kleinmans, their mother Teeny, did not go to work. There was only one other member of the family who had enough money to leave Parcha, and that was Zemach, who I've just labelled here. He was a shoemaker like the other men in the family, but he could afford to go and live in Warsaw, which was the capital city of Poland. So obviously we've got a very loving family. We're guessing quite a religious family. A large number of the people in Parcha would have been Jewish, and therefore most of their friends were Jewish, and most of their friends would also have been very religious, and religion would have made up an important aspect of their social life. So they probably would have got together as a whole family for the Sabbath on a Friday. They probably would have gone to the synagogue together with the rest of the community to pray. So although life was hard, the community probably helped each other out during hard times and protected each other. We're not sure whether they experienced much prejudice. The Polish government didn't persecute Polish Jews, but we know that there would have been some anti-Semitism. So the family might have experienced anti-Semitism in their home in Parcha. But as I say, most of the people around them would have been Jewish. So their community was very tight-knit. The final family I'm going to introduce you to is the Greenman family. So the Greenman family was a very small family. Leon and Elsa, his wife Elsa, were married. They'd got married in London, but they had moved to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and both of the two adults, Leon and Elsa, had lived in both places, both in Rotterdam and in London. So they were multilingual, they were well travelled, they knew about different places in Europe and enjoyed visiting different places in Europe. And we know that they were quite artistic because Leon and Elsa fell in love after Elsa saw Leon singing in a bar in Rotterdam. So they had very interesting lives. In many ways, they were a really modern couple because they were well travelled, they were well educated. As a young man, Leon had worked as a hairdresser. But once he was married, he actually took over the business of Elsa's father, who was a bookseller. And although he wasn't very rich, the family would have been comfortably off, certainly comfortably well off enough for Elsa to just stay at home and look after Barney. And she was also a carer for her grandmother in Rotterdam too. It's highly unlikely that the Greenmans would have experienced much anti-Semitism because the Netherlands was a forward-thinking country. They had liberal attitudes towards the way people could behave. They had free speech. And many people might not even have known that the Greenmans were Jewish. They certainly lived a happy life in the Netherlands, and they felt quite far away from any of the problems that started to arise in Germany. And they probably felt relatively safe even when the Nazis came to power. Okay, so I'd like you now to have a go at those activities that we discussed before we looked at the three different families. So there were 5 questions for you to answer. It might be helpful for you to go back a little bit in the video and to go back and re-listen to any of the descriptions of these families. And then I would like you to answer those questions. Please answer them in full sentences. Okay, so we've come to the end of the lesson. I just wanted to finish by looking at this quote from Cheryl Silver Akayan, who's done a lot of research into the best way to learn about the Holocaust. I'm just going to read what she says because I think it's a really good reflection of what we've learned today. So there was no one way to be a Jew. They were traditional and modern, orthodox and progressive, and every shade in between. They were Nobel Prize winners, they were tailors and tradesmen. They were wealthy, and they were so poor that they couldn't afford shoes for their children in the winter. They went to religious schools, they prayed, and they respected the 2,000-year-old Jewish tradition. But they also went to movies, played sports, and danced the tango. They fell in love, had fun, they were busy with life, looking forward to the future. And I think that gives us a really good idea of just how diverse the Jewish community was in different parts of Europe. They were all individuals, just like every one of us is an individual. Some of them were united by their commitment to religion, but there were other people who would have seen themselves as Jewish who didn't even feel very religious. So there were huge differences between the different families. And you can see that in the families that we looked at as well. For most of them, their concerns would have been similar to our concerns today. How am I going to look after my family? What am I going to do to enjoy myself this year? So that gives us hopefully a bit of an idea of who the Jewish people in Europe were in the 1920s. So this lesson, what you should have done is written a date and title to make sure your work is neat and organised. You should have written 50 words to describe life for Jewish people, and you should have done that for Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and for Germany. And finally, you should have answered 5 questions about the 3 Jewish families that you've been introduced to. Okay, so well done, Year 9. This is your first lesson for this week. You need to do one more lesson for this week. So what you need to do now is stop this video and go on to the next video, which is about the persecution that Jewish people sometimes experience in Europe at this time. Well done.